In 1482, Spain gave its Jewish population a choice: convert, leave, or die. The Alhambra Decree of 1492 ordered the expulsion of all practicing Jews from the kingdoms of Spain. Roughly 200,000 people were forced to choose between their faith and their homeland. Tens of thousands converted to Christianity. They were called conversos. Publicly Catholic. Privately, many continued Jewish practices in secret for generations. The Inquisition hunted them for centuries. Informants watched for signs, lighting candles on Friday evening, refusing pork, washing the dead before burial. Any trace of Jewish practice could mean imprisonment, torture, or death at the stake. The Inquisition published manuals listing signs of secret Judaism, changing bed linens on Fridays, naming children after Old Testament figures, turning to face the wall when dying. Everyday acts became evidence of heresy. Converso families developed coded language, passing religious knowledge only to trusted children. But some conversos found a way out. They sailed to the colonies, and they disappeared. When Spain colonized the Americas, converso families saw an opportunity. The New World was far from the Inquisition's headquarters. Records were incomplete. Identity could be reinvented. Colonial passenger records from the 1500s show families with surnames, now recognized as converso indicators. Names like De Leon, De Silva, Cardoso, and Espinosa appear on ship manifests bound for Mexico, Peru, Colombia. They built new lives, they married into local families, they attended Catholic Mass, and within a generation or two, most descendants had no conscious memory of their Jewish origins. Converso families took Catholic godparents and sponsored church festivals. External conformity became survival instinct, refined across generations. Some converso families left coded markers in church records. Genealogists have identified hidden symbols in marriage certificates and baptismal records, small acts of defiance embedded in documents of submission. But the DNA remembered 500 years of Catholic identity could not erase the genetic signatures the conversos carried from medieval Spain. 5 centuries of admixture with indigenous, African, and non-Jewish European populations had diluted but not erased the Sephardic markers. They survived like watermarks in ancient paper, invisible until you knew how to look. And when geneticists finally tested Latin American populations, the results stunned everyone. In 2018, Juan Camilo Chacon, Duke, and colleagues published a landmark study in Nature Communications. They analyzed the genomes of over 6,000 individuals from Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. The study found that up to 23% of Latin Americans surveyed carried detectable Sephardic Jewish ancestry. The research team had expected to find some Sephardic ancestry. 23% was beyond any prediction. The scale of the hidden migration was far larger than historians had estimated from documentary sources alone, not in trace amounts. In segments large enough to indicate relatively recent admixture, consistent with the colonial period. 23%. In a region of over 600 million people, that translates to potentially tens of millions of individuals carrying genetic evidence of ancestors who were Jewish 5 centuries ago. The study's methodology was precise. The researchers used a technique called identity by descent analysis, which identifies long shared DNA segments between individuals. These shared segments act like molecular fingerprints, linking people to specific ancestral populations. When the Latin American samples were compared against reference panels that included Sephardic Jewish populations from Turkey, Greece, and Morocco, the matches were unmistakable. The shared DNA segments were long enough to indicate common ancestors within the past 30 to 40 generations. Precisely the time frame of the colonial converso migration. Before the expulsion, the Iberian Jewish community was one of the largest and most influential in the world. At its peak, the Iberian Jewish community numbered roughly 300,000 people. They were physicians, astronomers, translators, financiers, and poets. The expulsion did not just displace a religious minority. It dismantled one of medieval Europe's most intellectually productive communities. The Kabbalah, the Zohar, the golden age of Hebrew poetry, all products of the Iberian Jewish world that the Alhambra decree destroyed. The conversos who sailed west carried fragments of this intellectual heritage alongside their genes. Sephardic Jews had lived on the peninsula for over 1,000 years, developing distinct genetic signatures through centuries of endogamy. Those genetic signatures included specific mitochondrial and Y chromosome haplogroups that distinguish Sephardic populations from other European Jewish and non-Jewish communities. Specific maternal haplogroups associated with Sephardic populations appeared in Latin American samples at frequencies far exceeding what general Spanish migration alone could explain. The statistical excess was impossible to explain through general Iberian migration. Conversos had emigrated to the Americas at disproportionately high rates, driven by persecution that non-converso Spaniards never faced. 500 years of Catholic identity, and the mitochondrial DNA still carried the signature of medieval Spanish Jewry. The Inquisition followed the conversos to the Americas. Tribunals operated in Mexico City, Lima, and Cartagena. Between 1570 and 1820, over 3,000 people were tried in the Americas for the crime of Judaizing. The trials reveal what the Inquisition most feared: families maintaining Jewish dietary laws, secret circumcision of male infants, prayers recited in basements and back rooms, a parallel religious life hidden beneath the surface of Catholic conformity. The punishment was severe: public humiliation in an auto de fe ceremony, confiscation of property, imprisonment, and for the unrepentant, death by burning. The Inquisition's pressure drove the crypto-Jewish identity deeper underground. By the 1700s, most converso descendants in the Americas had fully assimilated. The Jewish practices survived only as family customs, whose religious origin was forgotten. Families continued to light candles on Friday evenings without knowing why. They avoided pork as a family custom, not a religious commandment. They swept dust toward the center of the room rather than out the door. They covered mirrors after a death. The custom survived. The memory didn't. But the DNA preserved what 500 years of persecution tried to erase. In New Mexico, the convergence of DNA and cultural memory has been most extensively studied. The Hispanic communities of the upper Rio Grande Valley have maintained unusual customs for centuries. Researchers documented families who cleaned houses on Fridays, slaughtered animals by draining the blood, and avoided shellfish for reasons they could not articulate. In 2019, a genetic study of New Mexico Hispanic communities found elevated frequencies of BRCA1 gene mutations. The specific mutations detected, 185 D-log and 5,382 INS, are known as Ashkenazi founder mutations, but also appear at high frequencies in Sephardic populations. The medical implications were immediate. These mutations dramatically increased the risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Identifying them in a population that had no idea it carried Jewish genetic markers meant that screening protocols needed to be expanded. Medical geneticists began recommending BRCA screening for Hispanic patients in the American Southwest, regardless of whether they self-identified as Jewish. The genetic risk did not care about religious identity. The discovery had saved lives. Women who would never have been flagged for BRCA testing under standard screening criteria were now being identified and offered preventive options because a geneticist recognized the converso signature in their DNA. In Colombia, the genetic evidence was equally striking. A 2020 study by Garrett Hellenthal and colleagues found that communities in the Antioquia region carried Sephardic ancestry at among the highest levels documented anywhere in the Americas. Antioquia was settled by Spanish colonists in the 1600s, a period when converso immigration to the Americas was at its peak. The geographic isolation of the Andean Valley preserved the genetic signatures that more connected populations had diluted through broader mixing. The Antioqueno population showed a genetic profile that could not be explained by general Spanish ancestry alone. The Sephardic component was distinct, measurable, and consistent across the community. Cultural traces paralleled the genetic ones. Local historians had long noted unusual customs in Antioqueno families, specific dietary habits, business practices associated with historical Jewish communities, naming traditions that trace to Iberian Jewish origins. Surname analysis added another dimension. Inquisition records from Toledo and Seville listed specific Converso family names. Centuries later, those same surnames appeared at disproportionately high frequencies in Antioquia's founding families. Local oral traditions preserved fragments of memory that formal records had erased. Families spoke of grandmothers who refused to eat pork, who lit candles on specific evenings, who cleaned the house with unusual thoroughness before particular days of the week. But here is where the story takes a turn. The DNA discovery did not just confirm history, it complicated identity. The rise of consumer testing turned a scholarly finding into a personal revelation for millions. The moment of discovery often comes alone. A notification on a phone screen, a percentage that does not match any family story anyone has ever told. The gap between what the DNA says and what the family remembers is where the real human story begins. Online communities formed around the shared experience. Thousands of Latin Americans posting their results, comparing percentages, tracing family trees, and asking the same question. If my ancestors were Jewish, what does that mean for me? The rise of consumer DNA testing has revealed Sephardic ancestry to millions of Latin Americans who had no prior knowledge of it. Ancestry websites report that Sephardic Jewish is now one of the most commonly unexpected results among Latin American test takers. For some, the discovery is purely genealogical. For others, it triggers a profound identity question. If your ancestors were Jewish, if their DNA still marks you as partly Jewish after 500 years of Catholic identity, what does that make you? Across Latin America, small communities have formed around shared genetic discovery. Some have returned to Judaism. Others have incorporated Sephardic heritage into their existing Catholic identity. The responses are as varied as the people involved. Across the continent, people who had never questioned their Catholic heritage were discovering a genetic past no one had told them about. In Brazil, the genetic evidence is particularly concentrated in the northeastern states. Recife, the capital of Pernambuco, was home to the first synagogue in the Americas, established in 1630 during a brief period of Dutch control. When Portugal recaptured Recife in 1654, the openly practicing Jewish community fled. Some went to Amsterdam. Others sailed north to New Amsterdam, later renamed New York. But many conversos who had been quietly living as Catholics in the surrounding region simply stayed. The community that fled Recife scattered across the Atlantic world. But the conversos who stayed behind vanished into the Brazilian northeast. In the dry interior of northeastern Brazil, the Sertão, researchers have documented communities with remarkably high frequencies of Sephardic genetic markers. These isolated rural populations preserved converso ancestry that more cosmopolitan coastal communities had diluted through broader admixture. 5 centuries underground. And the genes never forgot where they came from. The genetic evidence also reshapes understanding of the Spanish and Portuguese colonization itself. The traditional narrative describes colonizers as Catholic Europeans who mixed with indigenous and African populations. But the DNA reveals that a significant fraction of those European colonizers were not simply Catholic Spaniards. They were conversos carrying hidden Jewish ancestry, escaping persecution by crossing an ocean. The Inquisition's own records inadvertently document this migration. Trial records from Mexico, Peru, and Colombia reveal converso networks operating across the colonial Americas, maintaining contacts and marriages within their community. The Inquisition tracked converso networks because they feared exactly what the DNA confirms: that conversion was a survival strategy, not a genuine religious transformation, and that the Jewish identity the Crown tried to extinguish was being transmitted through family lines across the Atlantic. The Mexican Inquisition archives contain over 1,500 individual case files. Modern researchers have been digitizing these records and cross-referencing them with genetic databases, connecting 500-year-old accusations to 21st century DNA results. In several documented cases, descendants of individuals tried by the Inquisition for Judaizing have been tested and found to carry the Sephardic genetic markers their ancestors were persecuted for hiding. In 2020, a study by Conrado Martínez Cadenas at the Universitat Yomai in Spain pushed the analysis even further, using Y chromosome analysis of communities across the Americas. The team identified specific paternal lineages that traced to documented Sephardic Jewish communities in medieval Spain. The paternal lineages confirmed what the autosomal and mitochondrial evidence had already suggested. The Sephardic genetic contribution to Latin America came through both male and female founders, not just one parental line. A Y chromosome lineage carried by a man in rural New Mexico matched a lineage carried by a member of the Sephardic community in Istanbul. Two men on different continents, separated by 500 years of divergent history, connected by a common ancestor who lived in medieval Spain. A tale of fractured heritage, of two distant lands bound by an unbroken thread. The ethical questions grow with every family that must decide what their DNA means. The Sephardic diaspora split into two branches at the moment of expulsion. Those who fled east to the Ottoman Empire preserved their identity openly. Those who converted and sailed west buried it for 500 years. In Thessaloniki, Istanbul, and Izmir, Sephardic communities maintained Ladino as a living language into the 20th century. Their genetic profiles, preserved through centuries of endogamy, became the reference standard that would eventually decode the hidden ancestry across the Atlantic. The Sephardic communities that fled to the Ottoman Empire maintained their identity openly. They preserved Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language, their religious practices, and their genetic distinctiveness. They serve as the reference population against which the hidden ancestry in Latin America is measured. Linguistic traces survive alongside the genetic ones. Certain archaic Spanish phrases preserved in rural Latin American communities match Ladino usage rather than standard Castilian evolution. The language, like the DNA, carried fragments of the original culture across centuries and ocean. For many applicants, it was the first time their hidden ancestry had official recognition. The ethical questions multiply with every new study. Who owns the story the DNA reveals? The individual who took the test? The community their ancestors belonged to? The researchers who decoded the data? Media coverage has sometimes sensationalized the findings. Headlines declaring millions of Latin Americans are secretly Jewish reduce a complex genetic inheritance to a clickable identity label. The reality is more nuanced than any headline. The ongoing genetic studies face a complicated ethical landscape. Some community members welcome the discovery. Others are wary of genetic determinism, concerned that a DNA result should not define identity. Rabbinic authorities have weighed in. Under traditional Jewish law, identity passes through the maternal line. A mitochondrial DNA connection to Sephardic ancestry could theoretically support a claim to Jewish identity, but rabbinic opinions on DNA-based claims vary widely. The tension between genetic ancestry and lived cultural identity is not unique to this case, but the scale is tens of millions of people across an entire continent potentially carrying the genetic legacy of a persecuted community that was forced underground half a millennium ago. DNA does not care about theology. It remembers what happened. The question is what the living do with that memory. The Alhambra decree was officially revoked by Spain in 2015. The Spanish government offered citizenship to descendants of expelled Sephardic Jews who could demonstrate their heritage. 523 years after the expulsion, Spain formally acknowledged the injustice and opened a path to return. Over 150,000 applications were submitted before the program closed. The Spanish citizenship program ran from 2015 to 2019 Applicants needed to demonstrate Sephardic heritage through a combination of genealogical records, cultural knowledge tests, and genetic ancestry documentation. DNA evidence was accepted as supporting documentation. Genetics became the bridge that reconnected the severed lineage. Genetics had done what 5 centuries of persecution could not. It had preserved the evidence of identity that the Inquisition tried to burn away. The return is happening quietly, one family at a time. In Mexico City, Bogota, Recife, and Santa Fe, communities are reconstructing identities that were systematically dismantled 500 years ago. The story of the Sephardic conversos is not a story about religion. It is a story about what persecution can and cannot destroy. The Inquisition destroyed synagogues. It burned books. It executed thousands. It forced an entire population to abandon their identity. And 500 years later, a cotton swab and a sequencing machine proved it all failed. 23% of Latin Americans carry the evidence. Tens of millions of people walking through their daily lives with no knowledge that 5 centuries ago, their ancestors made an impossible choice in a Spanish courtyard. Convert, leave, or die. They chose to convert, they chose to survive. And the DNA they passed down is the only witness that remembers what they gave up to do it. And somewhere tonight in a kitchen in Colombia or New Mexico or northeastern Brazil, someone is lighting candles on a Friday evening. They do not know why. Their grandmother did it. Her grandmother did it. The reason was lost centuries ago, but the flame never went out.